Yeah, like
Mike,
Right. Hello, everyone. Should we restart? Can we go live again?
just go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Suhana Nanda, and I welcome you all to Red Lantern Analytica's webinar. A little bit about RLA. It is an international affairs observer group based in Delhi, and we research on critical issues relating to China. The topic at hand today is China and Africa, and we have with us Sheetal Sinha, Mandeep Chaudhary, and Aditya Kumar for this purpose. Now, before we discuss the current nature of China-African relations and their implications, let us know a little bit about the history. So, Chinese lending to Africa dates back to at least the 1960s, when Mao Zedong channeled arms and training to rebels fighting for independence from European colonial powers. The support was limited at that time because China was just as poor as other African countries. But ever since, it has grown into becoming an economic superpower, always in need of new markets, raw materials, and seeking to boost its global political standing. In the past 2 decades, Beijing has handed out loans to developing countries at a speed and scope not seen since the US financed Marshall Plan in Europe after World War II. Mandeep, what are your thoughts on this?
thank you, Suhana, for asking this question. I guess when we're talking about the history of China-Africa relations, the first major investment that China made in Africa was the Sahara Railway Line. That was in 1970s during the Cold War, when Cold War was at peak, and USA and Soviet Union were also fighting for the dominance in Africa in terms of investment and soft power. So this was a rail line between Tanzania and Zambia that makes it an interstate railway line. And Chinese companies invested almost $500 million. And one needs to understand and realize that this was a huge and extraordinary investment, even for China, because it was stuck in their cultural revolution and their economy was not as strong as it is today. So that investment was made along with a lot of investments from Europe, US, and Russia. But the fact remains that between 1970s and 1990s, the poverty rate of Africa actually increased from 11% to 66%. So something definitely went wrong. Those investments didn't work. There are a lot of reasons for that. One can be the political atmosphere of different African states, the way they handled them, the way those investments were structured. But the point remains that after the Cold War, European powers, Russia, and US lost a collective interest in Africa due to this mismanagement and rampant corruption, and for various other reasons. So this was the perfect opportunity for China after the Cold War to have an uncontested continent where they can assert their power. And they have started doing that since then. If you see at that time, World Bank, IMF, or Club of Paris, all these groups of wealthy countries were sort of imposing a lot of austerity programs on Africa that were not really helping them, and they were also keeping them accountable for human rights violations and other activities. But Chinese investments didn't necessarily face that sort of constraints. They really invested during this period. So I guess in this panel discussion, it's important to realize that obviously the economics of these investments matter, but it's not just the economics. One needs to see, are they getting really return in terms of money, or is it some sort of privatization? How is it helping them in UN? How is it helping them in their media, in their soft power? So all these factors need to be considered when we are talking about their investments and their relations. Thank you.
It's interesting that there are so many different facets. So, economically, it is not just limited to return of investments monetarily. According to latest reports, the fact is that most of the oil, timber, and minerals that China buys from Africa can actually be sourced from a dozen of other places along the Belt and Road. Remember that we're talking about $154 billion of outstanding loans in Africa to a Chinese economy worth around $13 trillion. Aditya, would you like to add to this?
Yeah, so basically, what China has done is that in order, matlab, the way they have grown in China is basically as a strategic standpoint also because they want to share much more power in the international community. So it's one way to look at that. and plus they want to use it as you mentioned, as an economic base, because the as all the economies move towards being either developed or completely developed, the consumer base of the whole economy increases. So they have a dumping ground in Africa, which they are going to utilize it pretty well, especially after all the other countries are trying to boycott Chinese products, especially like India also. So Africa is going to be one of the phases where much more, what you can say, we can see a dramatic increase in all the production, what you can say, facilities, especially engineered or owned by China. Now, one more is that as a strategic standpoint. So, one of the best examples of this is the Djibouti port, which China took over around in 2016 or something. Now, the placement of the port is on the Horn of Africa, so it forms a major junction in the BRI initiative. If it comes to the day of light, or if it sees the day of light. So one more strategic standpoint is that they have been garnering support for all the resolutions that are being placed against them, especially due to the activities in like what you can say, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South China Sea, etc. So all the African nations combined give them a huge whichever nation tries to go against them, especially in the UN Assembly, they can actually show that we have this much support from these countries. So it's actually quite a brilliant initiative. And one more reason is that the countries are willing to, what you can say, accept these investments, because most of the countries, especially like Angola, Zambia, and all, these are war-torn countries. They have gone through a lot in the period, especially after 91. Like as Mandeep mentioned, after the end of the Cold War, nobody gave a damn about the whole African continent. Now China has finally stood up, and in 2000, like when they formed the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, so that was a a move ahead. Like in this COVID pandemic situation, also China is helping Africa to come out of it quite well. So that.
All right, so China likes to tame relations with African states with no strings attached, as Beijing provides infrastructure, technology, and opportunity in exchange for access to natural resources. So, reality is far more complex and deeper than that. It is also important to focus on human rights and how there are constant cases of human rights violation being reported. Parts of the continent's civil society are also seething after videos circulated on social media this month showing discrimination against Africans in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou. They have been forcibly tested, barred from public places, and also evicted from their homes, causing public outrage back home. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So the increased level of Chinese trade and investment in Africa is part of a larger phenomenon labeled as globalization. Before examining the specific conditions of Chinese involvement in Africa, it is important to consider what the literature says regarding the impact of globalization to human rights. In the past several decades, China has implemented hundreds of projects in nearly every African country, building hydropower plants and railroads, training medical students, paving roads, building ports, and so on. In doing so, China has helped raise the living standards and entrench the socio-economic rights of millions of Africans. In surveying Chinese scholarship in Sino-African relations, the issue of human rights comes up very rarely. But when it does, it often responds to abuses and chronicles that are come up by the Western journalists, scholars, and academics. This is in part because human rights is still a sensitive term in Chinese diplomacy, given the decades of accusations leveled against China for its own human rights abuse. China's conduct in Africa reflects the prioritization of socioeconomic rights over the type of human development. By targeting trade, investment, infrastructure, education, and agriculture, like you mentioned, China is trying to replicate in Africa the various aspects of its own domestic economic transformation. At the same time, the lax environmental and labor standards by which Chinese companies operate in Africa unfortunately replicate the lax environmental and labor standards practiced at home. In other words, the African implementation of the China model may raise the living standards for some, but will simultaneously depress the quality of life for others. China is currently Africa's largest trading partner, having surpassed the US in 2009. The FOCAC meeting of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which began in thousands, symbolizes the growing ties between Africa and China and Africa and Chinese states. China and African states, the importance of economic development is central to the FOCAC discussions, where the official rhetoric advocates peace, security, and development through South-South cooperation. Those countries that benefit the most from China's interest in the region are those with the resources and trade capacity necessary to drive China's economic growth, such as Sudan with its oil reserves and South Africa with its strong trade relations and the mineral wealth. At Nasty International, we have documented the human cost of Chinese mining in Mozambique and the Central African Republic, and China's role in supply chains of cobalt mined by children and adults in hazardous conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo, far from being isolated. Incidents digging deeper into its relationship. The silence on the videos evidencing discrimination against Africans extend far beyond Guangzhou. The fact that no country has publicly criticized China for its human rights violations and abuses that we know it is carrying out against the ethnic minorities in Xinjiang tells us that xenophobia is one of the major problems that are lurking beneath the surface in the African states. Thank you.
All right. And in just over a decade, China has dramatically expanded its media presence in Africa, urging not just African publics to tell China's story well, but also influencing the continent's underlying telecommunications, data, and information standards. Given that United States has held a competitive advantage historically in communications and media, do you think it should pay more attention?
I guess, Suhana, that is an interesting question because China recently in 2016 and then 18 subsequently launched a media channel, or you can call it an association called China Global Television Network, which is basically a Chinese media channel in English language, where it tells about Chinese culture, Chinese investment in more than 24 African nations. And it may not be right now catering to a lot of audience or may not have a lot of viewership, but the important thing here to understand is that a foreign policy of a nation is nothing but how it defines itself. And China has always been accused of being secretive or not so democratic. But here they have a media channel in a continent where they're constantly self defining themselves. So that is a crucial step in terms of their relations. And this is also a nation which generally prefers bilateral relations with other countries instead of having a multilateral organization or dealing with them at a multilateral level. So that is one thing. Now coming to the whole technology-based setup that China has done in Africa in terms of the 5G network, say. The US sanctions which were recently imposed on Huawei, many of African nations didn't follow those sanctions. In fact, in South Africa, the four biggest telecommunication companies wrote a joint letter to their president demanding that these sanctions must not be conformed in their own country. So again, the point is that most of the times we hear this news where we demonize China as well, calling it an imperialism, colonialism, using these terms without not always knowing their context. In this case, for example, in 5G, some of the African nations are actually supporting China, and it is the most logical thing to do if they believe that from a wide range of possibilities, this is the cheapest thing they are getting at a cheaper level, and that's what they are doing. So if it will also be wrong to immediately brand China as someone manipulating the media or brainwashing African nations. But yeah, there are battles going on in terms of the technology, in terms of media, but all nation states do that. Now, the important thing to analyzing the situation with the coming years is that what this media influence does, how it pays, and how it is used. And from the Western world pointing out all those reports coming in terms of the elections, the whole Russia-US debacle, or when we mention about Chinese investments in India as well, they are not completely banned or completely disentangled from our system. So it's not that as easy as to just get rid of something when you are getting a profit out of that thing. So I guess that is how I would like to sum up the whole media scene.
Right, so just to follow up to that, we had a question in the comment section because you mentioned imperialism and colonialism. The question says, how should we differentiate between Western imperialism and Chinese new colonialism in Africa? So if you'd like to add to that or anybody else.
Should we differentiate between Western imperialism and
Again,
Chinese
what I just
imperialism?
Yes.
would you like to answer it, or should I?
नहीं तेरे को बोलना है क्यों you can go ahead.
All right.
So okay,
I guess what I was
according
trying
to
to
me,
say earlier.
okay, so Western imperialism.
Okay, so we can have Mandeep first. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go.
Now, first Mandeep will go, then I will go.
All right. So I will try to wrap this up briefly. So what I was trying to say earlier also that all Chinese investments collectively cannot be simply categorized under term of colonialism or imperialism. Yes, BRI is happening. Yes, a lot of investments are being made in technology, and a lot of profits are also being happening. A lot of mining is also being done, and then simultaneously there are human right violations as well. But what I'm basically trying to say in a very larger context is that we need to separate the things that are wrong with those investments or Chinese practices and the things that are not really wrong or are just remuneration-based investments, which are the main intention behind that investment is okay, we are giving you remuneration and taking something in exchange, quid pro quo. So we need to separate those lines and not just say, oh, everything that is happening from Chinese perspective in Africa is imperialism, or whatever West did in terms of McDonaldization of the world or everything is harmful. Because we must remember Africa is not just a continent, it is separate nation states with their own sovereignty, with their own different setup of governments and their different power structures, power changes. So all of this needs to be considered, and I don't think so at a personal level that everything that is happening in China in terms of investment is an imperial project or a colonial project, colonial settler project.
All right. Aditya, do you want to add on to that or should we move on?
No, I think so. We should go. He summed it.
All
He
right.
summed it up pretty well. Yeah.
Right. So moving on, what are your thoughts on the Chinese political influence in Africa? What is it like?
Okay, can I ask this question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So earlier this year, Yun Son, co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the Chinese China Program, analyzed aspects of China's political influence in Africa's political capacity building through political party training, media elites training, and engagement through diplomatic corps. So, accelerating significantly since the 2000s, the CCP's engagement with African parties shifted from an overtly ideological dialogue in Chinese communism to a more subtle and expansive demonstration of the fruits of China's economic development. Based on the assumption that China's remarkable economic progress over the past few decades is attributable primarily to its political system, the CCP engages directly with African political parties, political leaders, and other elites to provide political training programs in China. So, party to party relations provide a foundation for China to deepen its partnership in Africa in contrast to Western countries, particularly in the United States, whose development finance advocates for a different set of rules. And in the 2018 FOCAC Beijing Action Plan for 2019 to 2021, promotes the establishment of a China-Africa Media Cooperation network in which China trains African media officials and journalists and promotes exchanges and visits as well as the joint production of media. In the 8 days during and around the summit, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with every leader from the 53 African countries present at the event, emphasizing Sino-African community of common destiny. Judging from the statements, according to an article in the Brookings, the summit advanced two political messages. Externally, China is making serious efforts to consolidate African countries' support of China's international agenda, especially in the light of Trump's administration and the trade policies of China. Internally, between China and Africa, China is upping its game on Africa's capacity building, a phrase currently spearheaded by China's soft power campaigns and efforts to promote the Chinese model of political and economic development in developing countries. I feel like with the promotion of Chinese media resources by national agencies and private broadcasters with Chinese backing, the sparse media environment of many African countries could see Chinese monopolization of news and broadcasted arts to curry favor for Chinese worldviews of soft powers. African media companies with partial Chinese ownership of African media have seen possible cases of censorship or content management. Chinese actors' influence on African countries' governance structures has a direct impact on norm building on the continent. And this is particularly true with the spread of the norm of internet sovereignty to African countries. Chinese firms have also exported hardware and practices applicable to surveillance states. China's diplomatic attention and resources devoted to Africa outpace of the US in measures of not only embassies but also high-level diplomatic visits. China's high-level visits have three complementary geopolitical goals. One, that they advance economic and political engagement with the continent. Second, offer a stark contrast to the US's Africa policy. And third, to provide direct channel to high-level Chinese officials for African leaders to voice their interests. China's diplomatic corps in Africa is playing an increasingly active role in shaping African public opinion through diverse social media channels and communication strategies. African governments and communities have, as a whole, lauded Chinese investment and aid, as well as its political engagement with the continent. As if, and if there is any political takeaway from the 2018 FOCAC summit, Beijing summit, it is that China's bid for Africa has heightened more than ever before, and Africa is emphasized as the foundation of the foundations of China's foreign policy to rally support of developing countries. I think that answers your question.
Right. So just to end with, if you could brief the audience on how China has reacted in the current times of COVID-19.
Yeah. So okay. So first of all, we can look at this picture in two ways. Okay. The first, how they responded and why have they responded. So first of all, when COVID pandemic basically reached Africa, I think so. China were the first to react in the sense that everybody knows that the countries within the African continent suffer from what you can say very poor medical conditions or medical not medical conditions, medical facilities. So it's quite difficult to actually take care of patients who are suffering from COVID-19. So China did send a lot, what you can say, a large, what you can say, supplement of masks, ventilators, and all, because as Bloomberg reported back in the day that in like the new Central African Republic has only had only two ventilators for around 50 patients. So you can see that the whole country has only two ventilators. On the other hand, the Central African region, what you can say, suffers from very poor medical facilities. So ventilators were required. So China did act upon that, and it was led by Jack Ma, who was a former chairman of the Alibaba Foundations. So you can see the response has been quite terrific because it has also been reported that the first vaccine that China develops will definitely be what you can say transported to Africa and support the what you can say patients actually like the COVID-19 patients. Now, why have they responded? Because see, the image of China in the international community has suffered a huge backlash because how they handled the pandemic in the initial stages. So they had to build support in whatever consequences they might say, what you can say, they might see in the assembly. So they're garnering support for this. As you can see in Nigeria, also there was like the activists who are going against these Chinese investments have been given a fire. Basically, like, dude, they are not even what you can say handling the pandemic. How do you reckon they will handle the situation of finances also? So what has happened is that by what you can say as reacting as soon as possible, Chinese have actually given them what you can say a saving face in the international community. That's it.
All right, this session has been so insightful. Thank you so much, Mandeep, Sheetal, and Aditya for joining us.